Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Since the dawn of 2025, new challenges and crises have been rearranging the world as we know it. The impact of Trump's trade tariffs, and now with the crisis in West Asia, oil prices are surging, trade through the Strait of Hormuz is at a standstill, and the continued conflicts in Europe could range from higher commodity prices to lower worker remittances and disruptions to businesses that have diversified into the region. While we have many episodes dedicated to the unpacking of the ongoing conflict in West Asia, today we will spend some time predominantly focusing on India's broader trade policy in this new geoeconomic era. How can India ensure economic growth and exports amid growing global volatility? How should India navigate the emerging geoeconomic order since the start of Trump's second term? I'm Aishwaria Sonavane, research analyst for Pakistan Studies and your host for today. And I'm joined by Anisree Suresh, research associate in geoeconomics at the Takshashila Institution and our in-house wizard for all things related to international trade and India's geoeconomic interests. Welcome, Anisree.
Thank you, Aishwaria.
Let's get right into it. I want to know that India signed multiple free trade agreements in 2025. And more are being negotiated with trading partners at an unprecedented pace. What does it say about India's trade policy?
Thank you, Aishwaria. We are once again at a very crucial juncture in the global order, global geoeconomic order with everything that's been happening.
Right.
Like you rightly said, since the dawn of 2020, so we had the tariffs and a lot of those things related to that. And now crisis, a conflict in our neighborhood. And if you look at it since 2025 beginning itself, we signed a lot of multiple deals as well, right? So, for example, we signed a comprehensive economic partnership agreement with Oman, we had a deal with New Zealand, and we had a deal with EU, the most important one. And we also had a deal with UK in the first half of 2025, right? So if you look at it, couple of these examples in detail, you can clearly see that there is a shift in terms of accelerating these, now how we negotiate in these trade policies, or in terms of how we go around the problems or challenges that we have, and how to the larger question is how can we kind of sustain our economic growth in this volatile situation, and hence the smaller issues when we negotiate with these countries kind of take a sidestep. Right, even with the India-Oman Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and it's a very strategically important one, right? So we got zero duty access on around 98% of Omani tariff lines for Indian goods, and it's very strategically important because it kind of ensures a lot of our West Asia supply chains, energy security diversification, and it's an important Indian Ocean trade corridor in that sense, right? And if you look at the New Zealand deal that we signed, after several rounds of negotiation, it's one of the fastest concluded free trade agreements in India's trade history. And the timing of that really matters, right? It's not there were no issues with these kind of deals or anything, but especially when it comes to dairy, New Zealand is one of the biggest manufacturers of the dairy products, and it's also we have a lot of stake in the dairy industry as well. But the timing, the geoeconomic churns of events kind of allowed us to have a fast track mechanism to facilitate these kind of negotiations and conclude these deals as well. So this FTA the New Zealand FTA allowed zero free duty access on 100% of Indian exports, while in return India opens up around 70% of tariff lines covering nearly 95% of the bilateral trade volume in a phased manner. So, in the sense, Indian exports previously faced tariffs of up to 10% on labor-intensive and value-added goods such as textiles, apparel, and engineering products in the New Zealand, and the FTA eliminated these tariffs in many sectors, including pharmaceuticals, processed food, all those sectors that we have a lot of stake on and where we need the market access. And in return, India also extended duty concession on various products, including apples, sheep meat, like fish, seafood exports, and all those things. And I think the important one is again dairy. Like we have been holding on to that sector in the sense like we do not want to open it up and all those things. But the deal with the EU kind of facilitated the supply of New Zealand products duty free to India for further manufacturing and export, especially for the dairy products. And we also, the tariff on bulk, infant formula, and other dairy based preparations will be phased out also in the next 7 years. So, in the sense, like what it shows is basically that uh, India is ready to open up many of its sectors which it has considered sensitive, which they felt that this is not something we should do, this is not our policy. So you can see that a gradual shift is happening in India's trade policy.
Right.
And it's also we signed multiple deals last year. That itself shows that we used to take years and decades to sign a free trade agreement to now how we can accelerate the process, how we can continue negotiating with these countries so that we get sustained economic growth in the next couple of years. And I think it's kind of a blessing in disguise of the current geo-economic order. But at the same time, a lot of issues there. Some of the, even if you look at the deal with the US, there's not a lot of guarantee about that deal, right? So at the same time, you have to diversify your markets. I think that strategic shift is definitely happening. And one thing I wanted to highlight is here, whether these free trade agreements are of are they really good for India and all those things. For example, if you look at in the Australia deal, I think we signed around the end of 2022. And if you look at the trade in the 2023-24 period and 2025 period, like a 8% growth in the trade between India and Australia, right? So that means in especially in sectors like engineering, petroleum products, textiles, chemicals, and jewelry items and all those things, India's exports to Australia grew by 8%. So that means these are working out. This clearly is working out well. And again, with accelerating, I think we'll get the result of all these deals that we signed this year in the next couple of years.
Right.
But I think it's doing well, and it's there's a lot of prospects when it comes to signing these free trade agreements and negotiating more with the countries. And as we speak, as the conflict and everything is emerging, Canada and India also kind of came together and said we will reset the ties after the the deterioration of political relations for the last couple of years. So again, last week, Carney and Modi wanted to expand the bilateral trade and sign a comprehensive economic pact with India. So while there is a lot of uncomfortable events happening, the series of negotiations and how we can overcome this the uncomfortable situation, that's also happening at the time. And I think domestically also we have taken a lot of reforms such as easing quality control orders and reconsidering import duties and all those things during the budget discussions, all those things that's happening. And I think the deal with the EU is also the one of the biggest deals, and it's called mother of the all trade deals for that matter. Yeah.
It's quite fascinating that you bring up New Zealand's dairy sector and the free trade agreement with Australia. I think this gets, at least for people who are not following trade agreements in such detail, it kind of gets lost in conversations of tariff and trade agreement with the US. Now I want to look at the EU, right? Coming to the India-EU FTA, from not joining the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership to concluding the deal with the EU. Could you explain this turnaround of EU-India ties?
Yeah. So this is very interesting again, right? One of the reasons that India joined RCEP was also because when there were a lot of issues with the China and all the other factors. But I think a large deal was always a bit of intimidating point for India, right? From that to concluding a deal with the EU, accelerating that negotiation and concluding it on time, I think it really shows that, again, going back to the point that there's a clear shift, or there is a clear pathway that India has right now to avoid all the uncomfortable situations. This is the only pathway that we have to enhance our exports, enhance our economic growth and everything. And when it comes to RCEP, the central concern was like India's trade imbalance with China. So China already accounted for India's largest goods trade deficit at that time. And while this deal with the RCEP would have sharply reduced the tariffs across manufacturing sectors, and there was quite a lot of uncertainty and concern, fear among Indian policymakers that there would be a lot of imports from China on electronics, machinery, chemicals, and all those things. And they felt that India lacked the competitive manufacturing to that depth to absorb this sudden liberalization.
Right.
But from that fear to now concluding a deal with the EU, I feel like, again, there's a clear shift. We have come a long way at a very short period of time, right? And so even if you look at the India-EU free trade agreement, we concluded the agreement after 20 years of negotiation. So it was not a short period. But
Wow.
while I think the highlight of the deal was not the period or anything, but it's a win of negotiations, of course, and that spanned 2 decades. But the timing of the deal matters more than anything else, right? At a time when the world is grasping for ways to manage the tariff chaos and everything. And this was before the interim trade deal that we announced with the US. So we wanted some leverage. We wanted to diversify our market away from the US and the uncertainty that it caused. So, of course, but again, we had a lot of domestic oppositions came from agriculture, especially dairy and all those things. And I think even when we had the deal with Australia and New Zealand, these concerns keep emerging, right? But I think EU, for that matter, is quite important deal for us, because it removed tariffs on more than 90% of its tariff lines for Indian goods. And while India will do the same around 86%, covering around 90% of trade on both sides. And they will partially liberalize a significant number of additional lines, bringing it to around 96, 99% of the trade between both countries. And India sectors like fisheries, chemicals, textiles, footwear, all these sectors would gain significant market access through these deals. And you have to know that these are the exact sectors that were quite affected by the tariffs imposed by the US, right? When we had the 50% tariff regime under the US administration. So these were, and many of these sectors used to rely on US market for 30% or more of their exports. So 30% of Indian export in these certain sectors used to go to the US. And with the deal with the EU, kind of offered okay, we can diversify. There's a lesser cost of diversification now than before. So that's something the timing of the deal really mattered a lot. And while you might not be able to completely replace the US market or anything, it does something just as important under these conditions. It created an alternative channel before firms are pushed out altogether. But we have an interim deal with the US now, and the tariffs have cut down from 50% to 18% and all those things. But at the same time, there's a lot of uncertainty when it comes to the US. Nobody knows anything. Those conditions still remain. And in that sense, the deal with EU, deal with other countries make a lot of sense, because we need all channels to be open to continue trade, continue diversification. There's no single dependency factor that would affect our growth if certain things change, considering that we live in a very volatile and economic world order. Right. And again, one thing I want to, sorry, I'm taking a lot of time with this thing.
This is very fascinating.
So I think one most important lesson about India and US, they chose to go around the areas of sensitivity and differences, right? It's not like suddenly after 20 years, all the differences just vanished into thin air, right? It always existed. It's just that we kind of learned through the hard way, maybe, how we can kind of negotiate agricultural provisions, how carefully we can struck the balance, so that there's a the political economy also has to agree with these kind of negotiations and everything, right? So India agreed to reduce or eliminate tariffs on certain EU agri-food products, such as olive oil, processed foods, and all those things, while kind of retaining firm protections for staples and politically sensitive sectors such as dairy again. So we kind of try to strike that balance to meet the demands of our political economy. And EU also has done the same. They also protected its own agricultural red lines while granting India certain preferential access to products where India is competitive and employment heavy, like tea, coffee, spices,
Right.
and all those sectors, right? And even if you look at the carbon border adjustment mechanism, and that had remained a major point of friction between India and EU in all these negotiations and everything for a while. Because India saw it as kind of a unilateral trade barrier disguised as climate policy. And so instead of allowing this dispute to derail the negotiations, kind of this agreement had a provision, most of like a forward-looking, most favored nation status, where it said like, if EU is like extending any kind of concession to any country in the future with regard to carbon border adjustment mechanism, it will be extended to India too. I think that's like we need such kind of more futuristic provisions as well in the negotiations, because that helps us to see like how we can manage future difficulties or challenges in the relations between two countries, and so that doesn't derail the free trade agreements.
That's fascinating. And from what I gained from everything that you said, my takeaway was that diversification is healthy. And
Yes.
that is something that India is doing. And given India's recent push to sign multiple FTAs and deepen economic partnerships, again, diversify partnerships, I want to zoom out and understand uh, what should India's long-term trade strategy look like?
Again, yeah, going back to, I think this is a very interesting juncture, right? I think why we discussed all these trade negotiations and everything is also because markets are becoming instruments of foreign policy without formal alliances, right? So we live in a world right now, there's a clear vacuum of world trade organizations or any kind of rule based order in that sense. And that means like your market access, the free trade agreement also becomes tools of like foreign policy, tools of your national interest, tools of your like how you project your country and everything. So in this volatile environment under current Trump administration, it's very difficult to look at the initial framework agreement with the US as same as the other deals that we have. So that's a stand I want to take. For example, if you take like the US announced a trade deal with the EU in July 2025. However, then with the all issue of the Greenland and everything, Trump again threatened of a tariff of another 10% of many of its European allies, saying and like gone back on the word of like on the deal and everything.
Yeah.
So hence India cannot treat the deal or with the US as the same as other FTAs, even if it's an interim framework. We have to see that it's very limited in scope and it's very subject to reversal. So that's a conditionality period. But we
And
have
there's volatility with the
Yes.
president
So
being.
you need a secured, stable environment for any business to like
Thrive.
yeah, right. So that means like you have to look at it as a fragile window of opportunity because negotiations are happening. So that means it's like a fragile window of opportunity for you to diversify. You have to continue the trade as well, because it's not easy to completely take and
Absolutely.
shift one trade entirely from one country to other. But you have to slowly diversify, you have to enhance your global competitiveness, and India has to see like what's your leverage as a country, like where is your export, where is all that global competitiveness scale you have to see. And lastly, you have to diversify, do not depend on any single export market. You have to diversify. That's so I think the long term strategy lies in like diversification and to much more predictable market environment basically, or environments. So at the same time, like I said, like it has to improve its global competitiveness as well, right? So that means you have to lower the domestic cost, improve the logistics, and reduce regulatory friction to build a very export friendly ecosystem domestically. And this might help India to maintain a percentage of its existing market share in the US and become less competitive in the than its peers in the market. And it has to reduce its domestic cost. India must also reduce its tariff on intermediate inputs, all those kind of the things that we always discuss. It has to be done. So if you have a good domestic environment that support global competitiveness, it helps a lot in terms of its exports, in terms of like reduce that friction between like how you export and how you sell it internally and all those things. So I think that's very much important for trade diversification, as you know So our priority is like diversification and sign a lot of trade deals with other countries so that we get a lot of market access so that Indian exporters have the option and choice where they want to sell it so they can choose their markets well. And at the same time, we also have to ensure that there's no domestic friction in terms of regulatory cholesterol, in terms of bureaucratic red tapes, all those things.
That's fascinating. You speak about India's global positioning and how it presents to the world. I want to bring the conversation back to India's domestic situation. We say India needs to sign multiple free trade agreements to increase market access for exports. But do we have the domestic environment to support global competitiveness? And should India's competitiveness reforms precede free trade agreements?
Yeah, so this is always the debate that we had in India, right? Like, even while going back to the discussion on the RCEP, like why we didn't sign RCEP because we were so scared that where we open up our markets, that would reduce our global competitiveness. So we thought like we have to build global competitiveness first and then move to free trade agreements. But now, with everything that's happening in the world, we do not have time. And we are at a very crucial juncture of the economic growth as well. If India doesn't grow at like 8% or 10% in the next couple of years, then we might really miss the bus forever. So it's that like we do not have enough time to build the ecosystem first and then do the liberalization and everything. So we have to make sure that it's happening simultaneously at a rapid pace, because with everything that's happening, if we miss the bus right now, we miss the best forever. So just like a very crucial point in history. So again, like we always had this concern of even if India signs multiple free trade agreements, there's a low utilization rate. Basically, that means our utilization rate is 25% when we compare it with the developed countries is usually around 70 to 80%. So that means India is not utilizing the benefits of its own bilateral and plurilateral trade agreements. So it shows that there is a failure to accommodate the market, stakeholder perspectives when we negotiate in each FTAs and everything. So one thing we have to do is, while we sign a lot of free trade agreements, we have to maximize the FTA utilization. So that means there's quite a lot of things that you have to do, right? So we face a lot of challenges when it comes to factor market inefficiencies in terms of land, labor, all those things. And there's a lot of regulatory unpredictability when it comes to India. So we have to address that. And there are a lot of skill gaps. There's a lot of AI and everything. So like, what are the skills that we are they complementing the economy that we have? All those things is like something we have to concern. And of course, the standard compliance procedures and all those kind of things. So economic complementarity, in the sense if you're signing a free trade agreement with a country, are our trade, the goods are like complementing each other? We sell what they really need, or are we selling the same thing? Then it's just a lot of competition. So we need to have certain kind of economic complementarities when it comes to the markets that we are signing free trade agreement. And there should be a trade creation and trade liberalization, which are like critical parameters for assessing the success of any free trade agreement that we see.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so the economic complementarities kind of ensure that countries involved in an FTA produce different goods and services. So it's complementing each other, as it helps reduce competition and fostering specialization and all those kind of thing. And reciprocal market access and trade creation kind of focus on reducing trade barriers to generate new market opportunities and increase bilateral trade and everything. So basically, you have to ensure that all this market access, liberalization, everything leads to medium to long term economic benefits through the free trade agreement. And that's where we have to focus a lot on. And like I said, like we again have to go back to the regulatory challenges that India has, right? India's regulatory landscape needs streamlining, improving trade facilitation initiatives, whether we have good port infrastructure, customs procedures, regulations, whether we have e-business infrastructure. These are all very crucial for any trade to sustain, right? So we need to look at that. I think larger goal is we need to have a good FTA negotiations, concluding deals with a lot of countries that are again focused on economic complementarity, reciprocal market access, and improving our own competitiveness in the global markets. So that's a larger policy that we have to focus on and have a lot of policies and ecosystem that boost domestic competitiveness.
Awesome. Thank you, Anisree. So, to conclude, ultimately, India's trade ambitions will depend not just on the agreement it signs, but also on the domestic reforms that make those agreements work.
I think it should go like hand in
Hand in
hand
hand.
with one another.
Awesome. Thank you for speaking to me, Anisree, and thank you to our listeners for tuning in. We will see you in the next episode of All Things Policy.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle at Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.